every single time it failed. Anyway, so God's providence then moved on to Abraham's family. And so when you look at Abraham's family, we can see it represents Noah's family. So Noah then had 3 sons, but anyway, had Shem and Ham, who was supposed to be in the position of Cain and Abel, but Ham didn't establish the position of Abel, didn't inherit the foundation of faith. So Ham failed. So from Shem then, 400 years later, another 10 generations, which I explained before, this time it's 400 years because people didn't live as long, came Abraham. And Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. So you can see here that Abraham's family was trying to restore Noah's family. So let's have a look at the world in which Noah grew up, which Abraham grew up. Yes?
Why do you think life expectancy decreased?
It says in the Bible that God reduced people's life expectancy. Yeah, I know. Okay. It also says that in the Bible that God told Noah and his family they could eat meat. Eat meat. So I don't know if before then they were vegetarians and therefore living a lot longer, and maybe eating meat shortened their life expectancy. I don't know. Or maybe it's just.
If you calculate 920 years as 920 months.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, people generally speaking, they don't take these figures for life expectancy literally. It's just, because obviously, in biblical years, Adam was around 6,000 years ago. But actually we know that human beings have been around for millions of years. So it's obviously not supposed to be taken literally in that sense. And so, once you read these things in the Bible, you have to think, well, should I take this literally, or should I just think, well, maybe it's just there to try to answer that kind of question. And so where did Abraham come from? That's right.
Today is in Iraq.
That's right. Thank you, Savai. You're answering all the questions before I ask them. Obviously been here before. Okay. So Ur's in modern-day Iraq, and that's where the invasion of Iraq by the Americans and other countries happened. Anyway, so Ur was ruled by somebody called Nimrod. And Nimrod was basically a sort of prototype of all the dictators that have ever lived ever since then. He had this huge personality cult. And so his name actually means let us revolt. And so he was revolting against... No, he wasn't just a revolting person. He was he was revolting against God. And he liked to think that he was the king, that he was the God, and that, and he hated the idea there may be an invisible God that lived in the sky, that would judge him one day. Anyway, so as I said, he was a local dictator, and he didn't have a lot of power because everybody lived in their own little houses and their own little farms and had their own little businesses. And so even though he was a dictator, he couldn't actually dictate very much because he didn't actually have much power over people. So he came up with a cunning plan, and he thought, right, I want to, go and attack God and kill God. And so in order to do that, I've got to reach up to the skies. And so he decided he's going to set up this sort of building project to build this huge tower. It's what's called the Tower of Babel. But in order to do that, he needed people to do it. And so he decided to pay people, tax people, all the people who were in his domain. And from this taxation, he would start this great big public works building project. And he'd employed lots of people to work on building. And then gradually he would inspire them. And after a while, he got everybody working on this. And people weren't allowed to do anything else. And anyway, so according to the Bible, that God saw this going on, and God came along, decided to, this was not a good thing for everybody to speak the same language, and he disrupted what was going on and gave lots of people different languages. And so from that time, people had lots and lots of different languages. And so this is one idea that God likes things to be different. Anyway, so as I said, Nimrod had this personality cult, and so he liked having statues of himself and pictures of himself all over the place, and people were supposed to go and bow down to these statues and bow down to these pictures. Abraham's father was called Terah, and he was an idol maker. So what's an idol? An idol is like a little god. It's like something you make yourself, and you bow down, you worship it, or somebody makes it. And so that's what Terah was, an idol maker. So he used to make these little statues of Nimrod and sell these statues of Nimrod, and people used to have these statues of Nimrod in their living rooms and elsewhere, and they used to bow down in front of them. And so that's the world in which Abraham grew up, this kind of world of a dictatorship, totalitarian kind of world. So why could God choose Abraham? Well, God originally chose Ham, who was a second son, but then, because Ham made a mistake, then Satan was able to claim Ham. So Abraham then, he was the third son of Terah, an idol maker. So being the son of an idol maker means, idol worship is one of the worst sins, because you're not worshipping God, you're worshipping, created things. And so God was able to claim Abraham. So on what basis is God able to claim Abraham? What's going on here? Abraham, in that sense, is of whose lineage? Satan's lineage, the son of an idol maker. Yes? Very, very materialistic, not believing there's an invisible God or an invisible reality. And so he's changed his lineage from being on Satan's side to being on God's side. So how did that happen? How is that possible? Could God just decide, right, I'm going to pick Abraham? Right. Okay. So did Abraham find God, or did God find Abraham?
He found God.
He found God, yes. So he had to change his lineage then from conceptualizing and thinking of himself as the son of an idol maker, and thinking of himself as the subject of Nimrod. Yes? By subject, I mean normal way of subject. In other words, instead of being loyal to Nimrod, he had to transfer his loyalty and his sense of allegiance and his sense of identity from Nimrod is my God, Nimrod is my leader, Nimrod is the one that I worship, to actually my identity comes from God. It's God that I believe in, God that I worship, and God that is the source of my identity. So he had to go through this change of lineage, change of identity, change of self-understanding. And so Father said this about the change of lineage. Where's the change of blood lineage done? On the individual level, man has to go beyond the boundary of life and death. The individual has to go through a life and death situation for the sake of God and the future dignity of man. So in order to change your lineage, in order to change your identity, you have to go through a life and death situation. It's something you have to go through at the risk of your life. Yeah. So Abraham went through these kind of situations at the risk of his life. He changed his identity from being the son of an idol maker, the loyal servant of Nimrod, to being the son of God, to whom he offered his allegiance and his loyalty. So, as I said, God didn't find Abraham, but Abraham discovered God. So how did Abraham discover God? Well, there's a little book here, a story, just to prove to you I'm not making it up. So this is how Abraham discovered God. So Abraham had parents, a mum and a dad, and Abraham was a very inquisitive little boy. And what do inquisitive little children always ask? Why? That's right. So Abraham was always asking why. And so he was thinking to himself, did I make myself? No. Where did I come from? So he asked his mum and dad, where did I come from? And they told him the story of the birds and the bees, and that wasn't very satisfied with that. He wasn't very satisfied with the idea that a stork brought him along either. And so eventually they explained to him, actually, Mummy gave birth to you. Yes? We created you. And then Abraham said, wow, that's amazing. You made me. You created me. I'm going to worship you. And he started worshipping his parents. Anyway, after a while, he started thinking a bit more. And he realized, where did Mum and Dad come from? And he said to his mum and dad, where did you come from? Did you make yourself? And they said, no, we didn't. Don't be silly. We didn't make ourselves. Grandpa and Grandma gave birth to us. And so at that point, Abraham left off worshipping and bowing in front of his parents and went next door and started bowing and worshipping his grandparents. Now, after a while, he started to think, well, they're looking a bit old. Where did they come from? And so he asked Grandma and Grandpa, where did you come from? And they said, well, great-grandparents, our parents gave birth to us. Your great-grandparents gave birth to us. And Abraham said, well, where do they live? I want to go and meet them and worship them. And his grandparents said, well, they died. They're out in the cemetery. And so he went off to the cemetery, and he found their gravestones, and he started bowing down and worshipping his great-grandparents. And he looked at the name, and he saw that, they were born as well. And he looked at elsewhere in the cemetery, and he found his great-great-grandparents and his great-great-great-grandparents. Anyway, so he just spent all his time then in the cemetery worshipping his ancestors. Anyway, one day, because he assumed they were all down there under the ground, you see, that's where he's worshipping them. Hey, one day, some grave diggers came along, and they were digging a new grave, and they disturbed an old grave. And Abraham went along to have a look and see, and he saw in the ground there were just white bones, a skull and some bones. And he was really shocked, and he thought, goodness, what's happened? Is that what we're really made of? Is that what's going to happen to us all? And then he realized that the body had turned into dust. Yeah? And then he realized, actually, what we're made of, we're made up from the earth. And so Abraham then stopped worshipping his ancestors and started bowing down and worshipping the earth. Because he realized it's the earth which gave birth to our bodies. It's from the earth that our bodies come. Anyway, so after a while he's doing that. And then one morning he got up and it was really cold. And he wondered, why is it so cold? And, the sun was hidden by all the clouds and it's winter. And then Abraham realized, actually, where does life come from? Life doesn't come from the earth, but actually life comes from the sun. If there wasn't any sunshine, there wouldn't be any photosynthesis. He knew all this sort of stuff. And there'd be no plants growing or anything like that. And so he started bowing down and worshipping the sun. But at the end of the day, the sun went down. And he thought, well, the sun's not very strong, it's disappeared. But then the moon came out, and he thought, oh, what a beautiful moon, I'm going to worship the moon. But then a cloud came over and covered up the moon. And then Abraham realized everything in this world in which we live is changing. Everything changes. Nothing is unchanging. But behind this changing reality, there must be an unchanging reality. There must be an invisible God that created everything. Because he worked it out, as I said. I have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. You keep going backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards. You must come to a first cause. And so Abraham then, he worked out, just through logic, based upon reason, he worked out that there is a God. There's an invisible, unchanging reality behind everything, but also he realized that there's a first cause that started everything off. And so Abraham's belief in God then was based upon reason. It was a very rational faith. So we looked at this before. We looked at C.S. Lewis. He talked about faith being a reasonable belief, based upon reason. So if Abraham discovered God just through logic. So Abraham basically was a philosopher. Okay? So sometimes I wonder, well, who came up with these stories in Genesis? I think these are the stories in Genesis about the creation of the universe in 6 days and about Adam and Eve, I think these are the stories that Abraham told to his followers, because he had followers later. I think that's where they came from Abraham. I think he worked all these stories out for himself through his relationship with God. Anyway, so he believed in God. Anyway, so there's another story about Abraham and the idols. And this story you can find also in the Talmud. So both of these stories you can find in the Talmud and also in the Quran. Anyway, so as I said, Abraham, his father was Terah, the idol maker. And, Terah made idols, he sold idols. Hey, one day, it was market day, and Terah said to Abraham, look, Abraham, who's already by this stage a teenager, I can't go to the market today. I've got to go to the palace to meet Nimrod, to show him some of my latest statues. Can you take the idols to the market and sell them? today. And Abraham, who was a good little boy, said, yeah, sure, Dad, I'll do that. So he loaded up the idols onto the wagon. He took them off into the market, set up his table, put all the idols on the table and all their prices, and waited for customers to come along. And soon an old lady came along and said to Abraham, Abraham, I want to buy one of your gods. And Abraham said, why? What happened to the other ones you had? And she said, oh, somebody came and stole them. And he said, well, they can't have been very powerful if burglars could steal your gods. And she said, no, they weren't powerful at all. But I think your gods are much more powerful because you're such a nice young man. And then Abraham said to her, how old are you, old woman? It wasn't very polite, to be honest. And she said, I'm 85 years old. And he said, look, my dad made this last week. And he made that one last month in his workshop. How can you, an 85-year-old woman, bow down to a statue of wood and stone that was made last week or last month by my dad in his workshop? You're older than they are. They should be bowing down to you. And she thought, you're right, Abraham. You're dead right. So who do you worship, Abraham? And Abraham said, I worship the invisible God who created the heavens and the earth. And she said, well, I'm going to start worshipping him too. Anyway, this is how the day went. At the end of the day, Abraham packed up, put all the idols and everything back on the wagon and went home. He rang the doorbell. And his dad came to the door and said, right, how did you get on today, Abraham? Did you sell out? And Abraham said, no, Dad, actually, I didn't sell a single idol. And Terah was shocked. What? Was there somebody else selling them for less? What was the matter? They're really good idols. They're the best ones. What happened? And Abraham told him about his sales patter. And Terah thought, oh, God, you're a useless salesman. Nobody's ever going to buy anything from you. Next month, I'm going. Anyway, so next month came round, market day, and so Terah went off to the market to sell the idols. And Terah said to Abraham, stay at home and look after all the idols, look after the gods in the temple, make sure that they're protected. And Abraham said, sure, certainly, Dad. So Abraham went into the temple, and he went up to the largest idol, the largest god, and said to it, look, I'll be your messenger. You tell me what to say, and I'll travel all around the city, and I'll tell everybody about your message, that they should believe in you. Just tell me what to tell people. I'll be your prophet and your messenger. Anyway, the idol said nothing. And Abraham said, well, perhaps you're hungry. I'll go make you a meal, make you some lunch. So he went into the kitchen and made some lunch, brought it and set it in front of the idol, said, right, eat up and then we can chat, talk about it. And the idol did nothing. So Abraham said, well, maybe you want to eat in peace and quiet. And so he left the temple. So he said, okay, I'll come back in an hour. So he walked out. An hour later, he came back, and the food was untouched. Then Abraham said to these idols, you're not a god. You have no speech. You have no power. You can't move. You can't do anything. You have no life. You're a lifeless piece of wood, and you're just pieces of stone. I'm not going to bow down and worship you. And then he went into his dad's workshop, and he got a large sledgehammer, and he went round and he smashed all the small idols. There, you can see it. I'm not making it up. Smashed all the small idols. And he put the sledgehammer in the hands of the largest idol, and he went out. At the end of the day, his dad came home. His dad had had a brilliant day's fundraising. He completely sold out. He came into the temple to offer all his money and his earnings and his fundraising money to the gods, to the idols. So he opened the door, and he saw there's a scene of devastation, all these smashed idols. And he said, Terah called Abraham, said, to Abraham, what happened? Did people break in and smash the idols? I told you to look after them. What happened? And Abraham said, I did exactly what you said. I was taking really good care of them. After he went, I went to see the idols, and the big one said he was hungry. He wanted some lunch. So I went into the kitchen and made him a really nice lunch. And look, there it is. It's still there. Anyway, I knew he wanted to eat in private, so I left him. And I heard all the little idols demanding from the big idol that he should share his food with them. And the big idol told them all to shut up, and they wouldn't shut up. So he went into your workshop, and he got a sledgehammer, and he went round and he beat them all up and smashed them. And look, there's the evidence. The sledgehammer's still in his hands. And Terah said, what are you talking about? They're just made of stone, and those ones are made of wood. They've got no power. They can't get up and walk around and do this sort of stuff. Exactly, said Abraham. So why do you worship them? And Terah was really shocked when Abraham said this. And Terah said to Abraham, don't you worship them? Don't you worship Nimrod? And Abraham said, no, I don't worship Nimrod. I only worship the invisible God who created the heavens and the earth. And Terah was petrified. He said, that's really scandalous. You've got to come and see Nimrod. And so Terah took Abraham off to see Nimrod. And when Terah arrived, then he bowed down in front of Nimrod. But then Abraham just looked at Nimrod in the eye. And Nimrod said, why don't you bow down and worship me? I'm your God. And Abraham said, I only worship the invisible God who created the heavens and the earth, and who stands in judgment upon you and your wicked deeds. And Nimrod said, aren't you afraid of me? If you don't bow down and worship me, I'll put you to death. And Abraham said, I don't care if you put me to death, because God is more real to me than anything that you can do to me. I know that if you kill me, I'll be with God for eternity in the spiritual world. And so Abraham had this personal experience with God, and he knew God was more real than anything. Yeah? And so Nimrod then, according to the story, put him into a fiery furnace and tried to kill him, but some angels came along and protected him. And so at that point then, Terah decided it was time to pack up and leave home, and they moved off to Haran. So you can see here that Abraham's faith, Abraham then, at the risk of his life, he came to the conclusion that God existed, and he stood upon what he knew was true. Even when he was being threatened with being put to death, he wouldn't compromise with what he knew to be true. His faith was based upon the truth. He wouldn't deny what he knew to be true just because he might get put to death. He was like a dissident. You heard of dissidents? In the communist times, there were Christians, for example, who refused to say that who refused to deny the existence of God, even when they were threatened with being put in prison. And a lot of them were put in prison, they were put in slave labor camps, concentration camps, they perished, they died, because they wouldn't say God doesn't exist, because they knew God was real. They knew God was a reality. And so Abraham's faith then was based upon reason, and he knew that God was real. Yeah, so that's why. I said he felt God was more real than anything. And so they went off. Anyway, so Terah then, moved his family off to Haran. So I'll have a look at their family then. This is Abraham's family. So Terah then, he was an idol maker. Now, if you're an idol maker, what do you probably think? Do you think you believe in the idols, the gods that you make? No. You can imagine idol makers are probably the most skeptical people around. If you make gods, it means what's your job? Oh, I make gods. You can imagine, Terah in reality would have been a pretty skeptical kind of person about the value of worshipping idols. And so you can imagine that kind of skepticism would have rubbed off onto Abraham. Except Abraham took it a lot more seriously. Terah said probably quite skeptical, but he wasn't willing to risk his neck or risk his life. Whereas Abraham was willing to risk his life for what he knew to be true. Or his livelihood, yeah. Didn't want to lose his job. And that's the reality. Often people know something, but they think, well, okay, I'm going to compromise on this. And you can imagine, Abraham probably wasn't the first person to work out that God existed. But as I said, usually when people get threatened with losing their job or being put in prison, then they usually compromise or tell a lie or do something. That's the reality of the world in which we live. But Abraham was different. He was uncompromising, had this absolute faith, which was an absolute, total commitment to what he knew to be true, complete commitment to truth. Anyway, so that's Terah. So Terah then had 3 sons, Haran, over on the far left there, and Haran had a son and a daughter, a son called Lot, who later went off with Abraham, and Lot had 2 daughters, And from these daughters came 2 particular tribes in the Middle East. And then he had another son called Nahor, the second son. And he had a son called Bethuel. And Bethuel had 2 daughters, Laban and Rebekah, who Jacob later married. No. And Laban had 2 daughters called... Bethuel had a son called Laban and a daughter called Rebekah, who became Isaac's wife. And Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel, who became Jacob's wives. And then Terah had a 3rd son called Abraham. And he had a daughter called Sarah. So Abraham and Sarah were brother and sister, except that they were from a different mother. So Terah had more than one wife. Yes, and so one wife gave birth to Abraham, and another wife gave birth to Sarah. So Abraham and Sarah are actually half brothers, half sister. And then Abraham and Sarah had a son called Isaac. Isaac married Rebekah, who was, I guess, his cousin, second cousin. Then Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob married his sort of second or third cousins, and from them come the Jewish people. And Esau got married to a Canaanite, from him come the Edomites. And Abraham had a concubine. We'll look at this story later. Sarah's maid. He had a child with her, as Ishmael, when they come the Ishmaelites, the Arabs, and Muhammad. So it's a very complicated little family there, and interesting. Yeah. Okay, so just one last bit here. 2 bits. Okay, so what was Abraham's place in God's providence then? So when you think about it, actually, when you look at it in terms of history, Abraham is probably the most significant, important person that's ever lived in the whole of human history. Yeah? Because he changed the world more than any other single human being has changed the world. Because from Abraham come the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, yeah? Which is more than half of the people in the world today, either Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. So he completely transformed the world. This discovery that he made, that God exists, this changed the whole of human history, changed the whole of human culture. This discovery that he made, God exists, there is one God, and God is one, God is a reality. And so I think what he taught was what these stories you find in Genesis 1, about creation of the universe, Adam and Eve. I think that was Abraham's teaching. Because he went around not just teaching this old woman, actually had many, many followers. He basically started a new religion. And so when he left there with lots of people. He's basically a religious leader. Anyway, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." So God told him then, to leave. This is after his father had died. Told him to leave everything and to go to a new land, to the land that I will show you. So you can see that sometimes in the lives of your parents. Yes? Who here has a parent that came from another land? Yes, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah? And they felt God's calling, to leave their home, leave their family, leave their kindred, leave everything, and go to this country that I have called you to. Usually because they've been blessed to somebody from another country. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I'll make of you a great nation. And I'll bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this blessing, this idea of the blessing goes all the way back to Abraham. It's in Abraham that we're all blessed. Abraham's the first person then who actually changed his lineage, from Satan's lineage to God's lineage. Yeah? And it's through Abraham then that we're all blessed. So it's also very important here. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. An important thing there, that when we speak about these people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Jesus, all these people, we should always speak of them with respect, yeah, with blessing. If we bless them, then we'll be blessed. If we curse them, or we say, oh, so-and-so failed, they did this, then what happens? Then we get judged. That's the reality of our movement. Yeah. So we should bless, Abraham and the reality again is anybody who cursed Abraham and his descendants has, come to a nasty end. Okay, so that's down there, the bottom right-hand corner. So after this confrontation with Nimrod, they packed their bags and they went up to Haran, up at the top there, with Terah and his family. They moved all the way up to Haran. Then after Terah died, then God told Abraham to go down into Canaan, that land down there we now call Israel, Palestine. Okay. They traveled down there, and this last story I'll tell you. So when they arrived in Canaan, there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there. So you can see this little picture. When he arrived in Egypt, who did he meet on the border? In a little hut there, it's the immigration officials. They wanted to see his passport. And anyway, when they saw Sarah, even though she's an old woman, she's actually extraordinarily beautiful. And so when she arrived there, this rumor went out how beautiful Sarah was, this beautiful, beautiful woman had just arrived in the land. And so Abraham said to Sarah, look, you're incredibly beautiful, Sarah. If people find out that you're so beautiful and they find out I'm your husband, they're going to kill me so they can marry you. So that I don't get killed, why don't we just pretend that we're brother and sister? So if somebody asks you, just say, I'm your brother, okay? So what would you think? What do you think about that?
Well, he was anyway.
He wasn't telling a fib, it's true.
It's a half truth.
Right, anyway, so then they were taken to Pharaoh, down at the bottom there, so he went to see Pharaoh. So Pharaoh heard this beautiful woman had arrived in town, so he invited Abraham and Sarah around for tea. And after they'd had tea and biscuits and cakes and everything, then Pharaoh said to Abraham, right, bye-bye, and he invited Sarah to stay the night. So you might think, what's going on here? So when you look at the story of Adam and Eve, you see Adam and Eve were brother and sister. And then Satan came along, and Satan tempted Eve, and Eve fell with Lucifer. So when you think about Lucifer and Adam, as I explained before, Lucifer is this incredibly powerful being, incredibly powerful angel, incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly wise, incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly handsome, incredibly powerful. And compared to Adam, who was just a teenager playing by the river with his tadpoles and everything, Lucifer was a lot more attractive. Yes? And so when Lucifer started chatting Eve up, she was really amazed that this incredibly sophisticated, powerful person was interested in her, and she sort of became infatuated by him and fell in love with him, and they fell. Yeah? So in this situation here, what's going on is that Pharaoh then invited Sarah to stay the night. Now when you think about Pharaoh, he was the most powerful man in the world at that time. Yeah? Most powerful man in the world, whereas Abraham was just living in a tent. And so you can imagine then what it must have been like for Sarah. She's invited to live in the palace, stay the night, wonderful feather beds, beautiful silk clothes, beautiful a sauna and Turkish steam bars, and as many pairs of shoes as she could possibly imagine. You can just imagine the sort of sheer luxury of this situation. First of all, the luxury, but then the idea, wow, this is amazing. The Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, he's interested in me. Yeah? Anyway, so after Sarah had been staying there for a few nights, it's outside, some car alarm, I think. Anyway, there came a knock at the door, and Pharaoh came into her bedroom, and Pharaoh sat down on the chair and started chatting her up. Yeah? And then it says in the story that God sent an angel along to protect Sarah. This angel wouldn't do anything unless Sarah told him to. And so when Pharaoh started chatting Sarah up, then Sarah had a choice. She could either allow herself to be seduced and then become the queen of the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, and live a life of complete luxury, or she could resist his temptation at the risk of her life and remain faithful to Abraham, and if she was able to escape, to spend the rest of her life living on a camp bed in a tent. Those are the choices. Anyway, so when the Pharaoh put out his hand to stroke her beautiful hair, she told the angel, give him a slap. And so according to the story, the angel gave Pharaoh a big slap. And he sort of felt this slap. Who's here slapping me? Anyway, when he recovered his presence of mind, he started chatting her up again and again put his hand out to stroke her hair. And again she said to the angel, give him a slap. Anyway, by the time night was over, he was all black and blue all over, and he thought, well, I'm going back to my bed. And he went back to his bedroom, and he fell on the bed and fell asleep. And he had a dream, and in this dream, God appeared to him and told him that Abraham was his prophet and Sarah was his wife. And so he woke up at the start and realized, that was a really serious thing he tried to do. And so he gave Sarah back to Abraham, and he gave also Lot back, and also gave him loads and loads of wealth. And he also gave Sarah a maid called Hagar, who was actually his daughter, princess. He gave to Sarah as a maid. So you can see here what Sarah's doing. She's restoring the position of Eve. She's been placed in the same position as Eve was placed in, facing the same kind of temptation, and she had to decide, am I going to become the wife of the most powerful man in the world, or I'm going to remain faithful to Abraham? Yeah? So Eve gave in to this temptation and allowed herself to be seduced by Lucifer. Sarah overcame that temptation and remained faithful to Abraham. So by facing this kind of temptation and overcoming it, she was purifying herself. She was purifying herself of these kind of evil elements, purifying her womb, so that when she gave birth to a child, this child would be born with less original sin, with less evil inclination, less sun. So that's how restoration takes place. People get put in the same position as Adam or Eve or whatever, and they have to go through the same sort of temptations. But instead of giving in to those temptations, they have to overcome those temptations, and through overcoming them, they become purified. This is how the purification of the blood lineage takes place. Over generations and many, many generations, there have been people put in this kind of position and overcame that temptation, and through overcoming that temptation, they purified themselves and they purified their lineage, so their children could be born better than they were. Yeah? Over generations and generations, the lineage was purified, so Jesus could be born without original sin, because people have gone through these kind of positions, overcome the temptation, purify themselves, purify the lineage, so their children could be born better than them. Make sense? Okay, so we'll stop there. Thank you very much.